The transport shuttle Meridian descended through the thin atmosphere of Epsilon 9. A desolate moon orbiting the gas giant Vorthak in the Void Fang system. Dr. Alara Thorne pressed her face against the viewport, watching the barren landscape unfold below. Jagged rock formations jutted from the surface like ancient chains, and deep crevasses scarred the terrain in geometric patterns that seemed almost too perfect to be natural. "First time to the Void system, Doctor?" asked Captain Torres, the shuttle's pilot, his weathered hands steady on the controls despite the turbulence. "Yes," Alara replied, her voice barely concealing her excitement. "I've been studying the data feeds for months, but seeing it in person is different." Torres snorted. "Different is one word for it. Terrifying is another. You sure you want to be dropped off here? The research station hasn't had a xenobiologist in over 3 years. Last one, well, let's just say they found pieces of his exosuit scattered across a 50-meter radius." Alara's grip tightened on her research tablet, but her resolve didn't waver. The Void Fangs are the most feared apex predators in known space, Captain. That fear has prevented any real scientific study of their behavior, their intelligence, their social structures. I intend to change that. The shuttle touched down on the landing pad outside Research Station Epsilon 9, a cluster of interconnected domes and towers that looked like metallic mushrooms growing from the dead soil. As the engines powered down, Torres turned to face Alara fully. "Doctor, I've been flying these routes for 20 years. I've seen things that would give a Andromedian nightmare weaver the chills. But those Void Fangs, they're not just predators. They're strategic. They plan, they remember, and they hold grudges." He paused, studying her face. "You seem like a smart woman. Smart enough to recognize when you're in over your head. There's no shame in taking the next transport back to civilization." Alara stood, shouldering her pack containing months' worth of research equipment and personal supplies. "Thank you for the concern, Captain. But understanding requires risk. Fear is the enemy of discovery." As the shuttle's ramp lowered, the station's only permanent resident emerged to greet them. Station Commander Marcus Webb looked like a man who had seen too much and slept too little, his gray hair unkempt and dark circles beneath his eyes. Behind him trailed 2 maintenance drones, their mechanical limbs already reaching for Alara's equipment containers. "Dr. Thorne." Webb said, his voice carrying the weariness of someone who had given this speech before. "Welcome to Station Epsilon 9. I trust Captain Torres filled you in on the local hazards?" "He mentioned some concerns," Alara replied diplomatically. Webb's laugh was bitter. "Concerns? Yes, that's one way to put it. Come inside. We need to go over safety protocols before you even think about leaving the station." The station's interior was functional, but cramped with stark white corridors that hummed with the constant background noise of life support systems. Webb led her to a briefing room where holographic displays showed the moon's topography marked with red zones that seemed to cover most of the habitable areas. "The Void Fangs are crepuscular hunters." Webb began activating a 3-dimensional model of the creatures. Alara had seen the images before, but the holographic representation was more detailed than anything in the scientific literature. The creature stood nearly 3 meters tall on 4 powerful legs, its body covered in what appeared to be organic armor plating that shifted color from deep purple to black. Most striking were the elongated fangs that gave the species its name, curved sabers of bone that extended from the upper jaw like those of an ancient saber-toothed cat, but proportionally larger. They hunt primarily during the dawn and dusk periods when the thermal differentials create optimal conditions for their heat-sensing organs. Webb continued, "Adults typically hunt alone, but juveniles have been observed in small groups. Their bite force is estimated at over 8,000 psi, sufficient to crush most known materials." "What about intelligence?" Alara asked, leaning forward. "The reports I've read are contradictory." Webb's expression darkened. "That's because most people who get close enough to assess their intelligence don't live to file a report, but..." He hesitated. then activated another display showing behavioral analysis data. We've observed tool use, problem solving, and they seem to learn from encounters with our equipment. Traps that work once rarely work twice. Over the following days, Alara threw herself into studying the station's accumulated data on Voidfang behavior. The more she learned, the more convinced she became that the scientific community was missing something crucial about these creatures. The attack patterns showed coordination beyond simple pack hunting. The tool use was sophisticated, involving not just found objects, but modified implements. Most intriguingly, there were reports of Voidfangs exhibiting what could only be described as rescue behavior toward other members of their species. On her 4th day at the station, Alara convinced Webb to allow her to set up observation equipment in the Crimson Valley, a deep gorge that ran for kilometers across the moon's surface. The valley was known to be a hunting ground for the Voidfangs, but its depth provided numerous hiding spots for observation posts. Suited up in the latest exo armor and carrying enough supplies for a week-long observation mission, Alara descended into the valley via cable lift. The armor was a marvel of engineering reactive plating that could deflect most projectile weapons. Environmental controls that could maintain comfortable conditions in temperatures ranging from absolute 0 to 800 degrees Celsius, and sensors that provided a constant stream of data about the surrounding environment. She established her observation post in a natural cave 20 meters up the valley wall, installing motion sensors and thermal imaging equipment in a grid pattern throughout the gorge. For 3 days, she recorded the comings and goings of the local ecosystem, small scavenger creatures that looked like crystalline insects, flying reptilian analogs that nested in the higher cliff faces, and one magnificent sight, a mature Voidfang stalking through the morning mist. The creature moved with fluid grace, despite its size, each step calculated and silent. Alara watched, mesmerized, as it tased at various points in the valley, esting the air with motions that seemed almost ritualistic. It was clearly following a scent trail, but there was something methodical about its approach that spoke of intelligence far beyond simple predatory instinct. On the evening of her 3rd day in the valley, everything changed. Alara was reviewing the day's data when her motion sensors triggered an alert. On the thermal display, she could see a heat signature moving erratically near the valley floor, smaller than an adult Voidfang, but larger than any of the scavenger species she had cataloged. Grabbing her portable sensors and a field camera, she carefully made her way down to investigate. What she found defied everything she expected. A juvenile Voidfang, perhaps 2/3 the size of an adult, lay trapped beneath a fallen boulder. The creature's left hind leg was clearly broken, and dark fluid that served as its blood had pooled around the injury. But what struck Alara most was the sound it was making. Not the aggressive snarls or territorial roars described in the literature, but something that could only be described as whimpering. Every instinct screamed at her to return to her observation post. This was exactly the kind of encounter that had killed her predecessor, but as she watched the creature struggle weakly against the stone that pinned it, she saw something in its large, multifaceted eyes that changed everything. Intelligence pain and what looked disturbingly like despair. Against all logic, against all training, Alara approached the creature. The juvenile Voidfang's head snapped toward her as she drew near, and for a moment she thought she had made a fatal mistake. But instead of attacking the creature, simply watched her. Its breathing labored, its body trembling with exhaustion. "Easy," Alara whispered, though she knew the creature couldn't understand her words. "I'm not going to hurt you." She activated her exosuit's strength enhancement and began working to lever the boulder aside. It took nearly an hour of careful work, but eventually she managed to free the creature's leg. The juvenile Voidfang immediately tried to stand, collapsed, tried again, and collapsed once more. Without thinking, Alara reached into her supply pack and pulled out one of her emergency protein bars. She had no idea if the creature could digest human food, but proteins were proteins, and the creature was clearly weakened from its ordeal. She held the bar out cautiously. The juvenile Voidfang's head tilted an almost dog-like gesture that was startling in such a fearsome predator. After a moment's hesitation, it carefully took the protein bar in its mouth, biting down gently to avoid crushing it. Alara watched in amazement as the creature ate its movements, becoming slightly less labored. Over the next several hours, Alara found herself in the surreal position of providing first aid to one of the galaxy's most dangerous predators. She used her suit's medical supplies to clean and dress the creature's wounds, all while maintaining a careful monologue that seemed to keep it calm. "The bone doesn't appear to be completely severed," she said, running her suit's medical scanner over the injured leg. "Fractured certainly, but with proper care it should heal. The question is whether you'll let me help you." As if in response, the juvenile Voidfang shifted its position, extending the injured leg toward her in a gesture that seemed almost trusting. Alara named the creature Rage, not for any aggressive behavior which had been notably absent, but for the fury she felt at how these magnificent beings had been misrepresented by the galactic scientific community. Over the following days, she split her time between her observation duties and caring for Rage. The creature proved remarkably intelligent, quickly learning to associate certain sounds with specific actions. When Alara clicked her tongue twice, Rage would extend his injured leg for examination. 3 clicks meant food. A low whistle meant danger. Something Alara discovered worked when she spotted an adult Voidfang approaching their location. To her amazement, when the adult appeared, Rage made a series of low rumbling sounds. The adult approached cautiously, sniffed at both Rage and Alara, then settled down nearby in what could only be described as a protective posture. For 2 hours, the three of them remained in an uneasy detente, with Alara documenting everything, while the adult Voidfang kept watch. On her 7th day in the valley, Alara received an urgent communication from Station Commander Webb. "Dr. Thorne, you need to return immediately. We've received word that a UGF inspection team that is inbound. They're arriving in 6 hours, and they're specifically coming to review your research methods." Alara felt her stomach drop. She had been dreading this moment. "What's their composition?" "Admiral Vex is leading the team along with General Dox from Xenobiological Safety Division. There are also representatives from the Ethics Committee and the Dangerous Species Board." Admiral Helena Vex was known throughout the UGF as a hardliner who believed that dangerous alien species should be contained or eliminated, not studied. General Michael Dox had built his career on developing containment protocols for hostile alien life forms. Neither was likely to approve of Alara's unorthodox methods. "I'll be there in 2 hours," Alara promised. She turned to Rage, who had been listening to the conversation with obvious interest. Over the past week, the creature had shown remarkable improvement. The leg was healing well, and Rage was able to move around the immediate area, though long-distance travel was still beyond his capabilities. "I have to go," she said softly, kneeling beside the creature. "Some people are coming who, well, they might not understand what we've accomplished here." Rage's large eyes seemed to study her face, and he made a soft sound she had come to interpret as concern. "I'll be back," she promised, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. The return journey to the station felt interminable. As her transport lifted out of the valley, Alara saw Rage watching from their campsite, and she felt a pang of loss that surprised her with its intensity. Station Epsilon 9 was buzzing with activity when she arrived. The UGF inspection team had arrived early and had already begun their review. Alara barely had time to shower and change into a clean uniform before she was summoned to the station's main conference room. The inspection team was exactly as intimidating as she had feared. Admiral Vex was a tall, severe woman with steel-gray hair and ice-blue eyes that seemed to see through everything they looked at. General Dox was shorter, but no less formidable, his scarred face speaking of decades of dangerous encounters with hostile alien life. The other committee members, representatives from Ethics, Safety, and the Dangerous Species Board, watched her with expressions ranging from skeptical to openly hostile. "Dr. Thorne." Admiral Vex began without preamble. "We're here to discuss some concerning reports about your research methods, specifically allegations that you have been engaging in direct unsupervised contact with Void Fang specimens." Alara took a breath, choosing her words carefully. "Admiral, my research has been focused on understanding the behavioral patterns and potential intelligence of the Void Fang species. Traditional observation methods have proven insufficient for gathering the data necessary for a comprehensive understanding. And so you decided to throw safety protocols out the airlock," General Dox interjected. "Do you have any idea how many xenobiologists we've lost to Void Fang attacks over the past decade?" "I'm aware of the historical statistics," Alara replied. "What I'm also aware of is that every single previous study has approached these creatures from a position of fear and hostility. We've tried to study them as specimens to be contained, rather than as potentially intelligent beings to be understood." The representative from the ethics committee, a thin man named Dr. Phillips, leaned forward. "Dr. Thorne, are you seriously suggesting that Void Fangs should be classified as sentient?" "I'm suggesting that we don't have enough information to make that determination either way," Alara said firmly. "And the only way to gather that information is through direct observation and, yes, carefully managed interaction." Admiral Vex's expression grew even more severe. "Dr. The Void Fang is classified as a Class A hostile species. Their bite can crush titanium steel alloy. They've been responsible for the destruction of entire colonies. The idea of interaction with such creatures is not just dangerous, it's insane. With respect, Admiral, that classification is based on limited data gathered under hostile circumstances," Alara argued. "When every human Void Fang encounter begins with humans attempting to kill or capture them, of course they respond aggressively. My research suggests that their behavior may be far more complex than we've previously understood." General Dox slammed his hand on the table. "Your research? You mean your reckless endangerment of yourself and this station? We have reports that you've been spending extended periods in Void Fang territory without proper backup, without authorization, and without following basic safety protocols." Before Alara could respond, alarms began blaring throughout the station. The communication system crackled to life with Station Commander Webb's voice. "All personnel to stations. We have a large creature approaching the main entrance. Repeat, large creature approaching main entrance." Through the conference room's windows, they could see Webb and his security team taking defensive positions around the station's main airlock. On the external monitors, a familiar shape was approaching across the rocky terrain. It was Rage. "That's impossible," General Dox breathed. "Void Fangs don't approach human installations. They avoid our technology." "This one is different," Alara said quietly, and something in her voice made everyone in the room turn to look at her. On the monitors, they watched as Rage approached the outer perimeter of the station's defensive grid. The creature stopped just outside the range of the automated defense systems, lowered himself to the ground, and began making a series of low rhythmic sounds. "Dr. Thorne," Admiral Vex's voice was dangerously quiet, "do you know why that creature is here?" "His name is Rage," Alara said, standing slowly. "And yes, I believe he's looking for me." The room erupted in shocked protests, but Alara was already moving toward the door. "With your permission, Admiral, I'd like to speak with him." "Absolutely not," General Dox shouted. "I'm placing you under immediate arrest for violation of UGF Dangerous Species Protocol 7. But Admiral Vex held up a hand, her calculating gaze fixed on the monitors. "Let her go, General. I want to see this." The walk to the station's main entrance felt like the longest of Alara's life. Every UGF regulation she had ever learned screamed that what she was about to do was suicide. But as she saw Rage waiting patiently outside, she felt a calm certainty settle over her. The main airlock was designed to be a barrier between the safe interior of the station and the hostile environment outside. As Alara approached, she could see Rage through the reinforced, transparent aluminum viewing port. The creature's large eyes tracked her movement, and she was certain she saw recognition in them. "Doctor, please reconsider." Station Commander Webb pleaded through the comm system. "The blast doors are designed to withstand a direct hit from ship-mounted weapons. If that thing decides to attack." "He won't?" Alara said with a conviction that surprised her. "Open the outer door, Commander." "I can't do that, Doctor. Not without authorization from Admiral Vex." Alara looked back down the corridor toward the conference room where she could see the inspection team watching through the windows. After a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Admiral Vex's voice came through the comm. "Open the door, Commander, but keep the inner door sealed and all weapons trained on the target." The outer airlock door, iris dilated with a soft hiss of equalizing pressure. Rage's head immediately oriented toward the opening, and he began making those same rhythmic sounds Alara had learned meant greeting or recognition. "Hello, Rage," she said softly, stepping into the airlock chamber, but staying well back from the outer door. "What are you doing here? You should be resting, letting that leg heal." Rage stood carefully favoring his healing leg and approached the threshold of the airlock. He stopped just outside the doorframe, making no move to enter the station, and extended his massive head toward Alara. Behind her, she could hear the shocked murmurs of the inspection team as they arrived to observe directly. But Alara's attention was entirely focused on Rage, who was making a series of soft sounds she had never heard before. "He's vocalizing," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "These aren't territorial or aggressive calls. He's trying to communicate." Admiral Vex stepped forward, her hand resting on her sidearm. "Dr. Thorne, step away from that creature immediately." Instead, Alara took a small step forward, holding her hand out toward Rage. "It's okay," she said, though she wasn't sure if she was talking to Rage or to the humans behind her. "Nobody's going to hurt you here." Rage lowered his head until it was level with Alara's chest, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his breath through her uniform. With infinite care, he pressed his forehead against her outstretched hand in a gesture that was unmistakably affectionate. The room behind Alara fell completely silent. "My God," whispered Dr. Phillips. He's showing attachment behavior." "More than that," Alara said, her voice thick with emotion. "He traveled over 50 kilometers on an injured leg to find me. Voidfangs are supposed to be solitary except during mating season, but he formed a bond." Rage pulled back slightly and made a series of quick, sharp sounds while looking back and forth between Alara and the gathered humans. Then, in a gesture that made everyone in the room freeze, he moved backward from the doorway and settled into a lying position, his body creating a barrier between Alara and the open landscape beyond. "He's protecting me," Alara realized. "From his perspective, I'm surrounded by potential threats, and he's positioning himself to defend me." Admiral Vex lowered her weapon slowly, her strategic mind clearly working through the implications of what she was seeing. "Dr. Thorne? This creature? Rage. How long have you been in contact with him?" 7 days, Alara admitted. "I found him injured and I couldn't just leave him to die." "You treated him," General Dox said, and his tone had shifted from accusatory to amazed. "You provided medical care to a Voidfang. Basic first aid, yes. And food. Protein primarily, but he seemed able to digest human nutrition supplements." Alara kept her hand resting gently on Rage's head, feeling the subtle vibrations of his contented purring, another behavior not mentioned in any UGF file on the species. The representative from the Dangerous Species Board, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke up. "The implications of this are staggering. If Voidfangs are capable of interspecies bonding, of gratitude, of what appears to be complex emotional responses, we need to completely reclassify them." "More than that," Admiral Vex said slowly, her tactical mind already thinking several steps ahead. "If Dr. Thorne has successfully established communication protocols with a Voidfang the military applications alone—" "No," Alara said firmly, finally turning to face the group. Rage is not a weapon. He's not a tool. If you want to learn from this, it has to be with respect for what he is, an intelligent being capable of forming relationships. And what exactly is he, Dr. Admiral Vex asked. From a scientific classification standpoint, Alara looked back at Rage, who had been following the conversation with obvious interest, his large eyes tracking each speaker in turn. I believe void fangs are not just intelligent, but socially complex. The aggressive behavior we've documented may be primarily defensive, triggered by our hostile approach to contact. If treated with respect, if given a chance to assess us as individuals rather than threats, I think we could establish meaningful interspecies relations. The implications hung in the air like a charged field. Every person present understood that they were potentially witnessing a moment that could redefine humanity's relationship with one of the galaxy's most feared species. General Dox was the first to break the silence. Dr. Thorne, you've just turned our entire understanding of xenobiological threat assessment upside down. If you're right, if void fangs are capable of this level of cognitive and emotional sophistication, then every protocol we've developed for dealing with them needs to be reconsidered. I know, Alara said, but I'm not claiming they're peaceful. Rage is still a predator. He's still capable of incredible violence. But that violence appears to be contextual, not indiscriminate. As if to demonstrate the point, one of the station's maintenance drones chose that moment to emerge from the airlock, making its mechanical way toward the outer defense perimeter. Rage's head snapped toward it, and for a brief moment, every human in the area tensed. But instead of attacking Rage, simply observed the drone's passage, then looked back at Alara with what could only be described as a questioning expression. He's learning to distinguish between threats and non-threats, Dr. Phillips observed. That level of behavioral adaptation suggests not just intelligence, but wisdom. Admiral Vex stepped forward, stopping just inside the airlock. Rage's attention immediately focused on her, and Alara felt the creature tense slightly under her hand. "It's okay," she murmured to Rage. "She's not a threat." After a tense moment, Admiral Vex spoke directly to the creature. "Rage, I'm Admiral Vex. I'm responsible for the safety of humans in this sector." She paused, seeming to feel slightly foolish talking to an alien predator. "Dr. Thorne believes you're more than we've given you credit for. She believes you can understand at least partially what we're saying." Rage tilted his head in that same dog-like gesture Alara had found so endearing, then made a soft sound that was clearly directed at the Admiral. "I'll be damned," General Dox breathed. "He's responding to her directly." Admiral Vex continued, her tone growing more confident. "If Dr. Thorne is right, if your species has been misunderstood, then we've made serious mistakes. Mistakes that may have cost lives on both sides." Rage made a longer, more complex series of sounds, and Alara felt a chill run down her spine as she recognized what might have been patterns within the vocalizations, not quite language as humans understood it, but definitely more sophisticated than animal calls. "Admiral," Alara said carefully, "I think he's trying to tell you something. These vocalizations have more complexity than anything I've recorded before." The group spent the next hour in careful observation as Alara demonstrated the basic communication protocols she had developed with Rage. The click signals for basic needs, the whistle warnings for danger, and the soft rumbling sounds that seemed to indicate contentment or agreement. But it was when Dr. Phillips produced a small holographic projector that things truly became remarkable. The device projected a simple three-dimensional map of the local area, and Rage's reaction was immediate and intense. He stood carefully, moved closer to the projection, and began making a rapid series of sounds while pointing with one extended claw at various locations on the map. "He recognizes it," Admiral Vex said in amazement. "He understands the concept of a map." "More than that," Alara said, studying Rage's gestures. "I think he's trying to tell us about something specific. Look, he keeps pointing to the northern quadrant of the valley system. Station Commander Webb, who had been monitoring their conversation from the security station, suddenly appeared in the doorway. "Dr. Thorne, Admiral, you need to see this. We've been analyzing the long-range sensors, and there's something in the Northern Valley that, well, we've never seen anything like it." The group moved to the station's main sensor array room, with Rage carefully following his movements, careful but confident, within the station corridors. The main display showed a composite image of the Northern Valley system, and what they saw defied explanation. Arranged in a complex geometric pattern across nearly a square kilometer of the valley floor were structures not natural rock formations, but clearly constructed objects. They appeared to be made from the same material as the valley walls, but shaped and arranged in patterns that spoke of intelligence and purpose. "How long have these been here?" Admiral Vex demanded. "We don't know," Webb admitted. "They're made from local materials, so they don't show up clearly on standard geological scans. But based on the erosion patterns, potentially decades, maybe longer." Rage had moved to stand directly in front of the main display and was making increasingly agitated sounds while gesturing at the images. "He knows what these are," Alara realized, "and he's upset about something." Admiral Vex studied the display with the eye of a military strategist. These structures show planning resource manipulation, long-term thinking. No mindless predator creates something like this. "There's more?" Webb continued activating additional sensor feeds. "We've detected regular movement patterns in the area. Large groups of heat signatures moving in coordinated formations. If I didn't know better, I'd say it looked like military exercises," General Dox finished, "or patrols." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. They weren't just looking at evidence of Voidfang intelligence. They were looking at what appeared to be evidence of Voidfang civilization. "Dr. Thorne," Admiral Vex said finally, "it appears your research has uncovered something far more significant than anyone anticipated. The question now is, what do we do with this information?" Before Alara could respond, alarms began sounding again, but this time the warning was different. Not the hostile approach alarm, but the long-range sensor alert that indicated multiple large objects moving in from the outer system. "3 ships dropping out of hyperspace," Webb reported. "Configuration unknown, but they're big, and they're heading this way." On the display, 3 dark shapes appeared at the edge of the sensor range, moving with purpose toward the moon. As they drew closer, their unusual design became clear, sleek, organic-looking vessels that seemed to be grown rather than built, their hulls appearing to shift and change as they moved. Rage's reaction was immediate and dramatic. He let out a sound unlike anything Alara had heard before. Not quite a roar, not quite a song, but something that seemed to contain elements of both. His posture had completely changed from the relaxed confidence he had shown in the station to something alert and protective. "Those ships," Admiral Vex said, her tactical training kicking in, "they're not UGF design. They're not any design in our databases." "But Rage recognizes them," Alara said, watching the creature's behavior. "And I don't think he's afraid." The lead ship entered the moon's atmosphere with surprising grace for something its size, and as it descended, patterns of bioluminescence began to flicker across its hull in complex sequences. Admiral Webb's voice was tight with tension. "They're broadcasting on multiple frequencies, but it's not any communication protocol we recognize." Rage's vocalizations changed, matching the rhythm of the flickering lights on the approaching ship. Alara felt her breath catch as she realized what was happening. "They're communicating," she whispered. "The ships in Rage, they're communicating with each other." The lead ship settled onto the surface, approximately a kilometer from the research station, followed by the other 2 vessels. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then a section of the lead ship's hull dilated like an iris, and figures began to emerge. Even at maximum magnification, the details were hard to make out, but the general forms were unmistakably Voidfang. However, these Voidfangs were different from Rage, larger, their organic armor more elaborate, and they moved with a precision that spoke of organization and purpose. "A delegation," Admiral Vex breathed. They've sent a diplomatic delegation. Rage moved toward the station's main airlock, making urgent sounds and looking back at Alara with what could only be interpreted as invitation. He wants us to go with him, she realized, to meet them. Absolutely not, General Dox said immediately. We have no idea what their intentions are. This could be a trap. But Admiral Vex was already moving toward the armory. General, in 30 years of military service, I've learned to recognize a historic moment when I see one. We're about to make first contact with what appears to be a Voidfang civilization. The question is whether we approach this with the same fear and hostility that has characterized every previous human Voidfang encounter, or whether we try something different. Admiral, the risks. Are enormous Vex finished? So are the potential rewards. Dr. Thorne, you've established a relationship with one Voidfang. Are you willing to try to extend that to an entire delegation? Alara looked at Rage, who was watching her with those large, intelligent eyes, then at the ships in the distance, then at the assembled UGF officials who would shape humanity's response to this unprecedented situation. Yes, she said simply, I'll go. The preparation took an hour. Admiral Vex insisted on a full diplomatic escort, while General Dox demanded enough firepower to level the landing site if things went wrong. In the end, a compromise was reached, a small party consisting of Alara, Admiral Vex, Dr. Phillips from the Ethics Committee, and a squad of UGF Marines in full combat armor, all equipped with the latest in personal shielding and weapons technology. Rage waited patiently as they prepared, occasionally making soft sounds that seemed reassuring. When they emerged from the station, he immediately moved to walk beside Alara, but positioned himself so that he could see both the approaching humans and the Voidfang delegation in the distance. The walk across the rocky terrain felt both endless and too short. As they drew closer to the landing site, the details of the Voidfang delegation became clearer. There were 7 of them arranged in what appeared to be a formal formation. The largest stood at the center, easily the biggest Voidfang any human had ever seen, its armor plating a deep, iridescent purple that seemed to shift colors in the moon's pale light. When the two groups were approximately 50 meters apart, both parties stopped. The silence stretched taut, filled with the weight of history and the potential for either breakthrough or catastrophe. It was Rage who broke the silence. He moved forward into the space between the two groups and began a complex series of vocalizations that lasted nearly 5 minutes. The large central Voidfang responded with equally complex sounds, and Alara realized she was witnessing something unprecedented, a formal negotiation between two species that had previously only met in violence. When the exchange finished, Rage returned to Alara's side and gently pressed his head against her hand, a gesture that was clearly visible to the Voidfang delegation. The largest Voidfang took 3 steps forward and made a single deep sound that seemed to resonate in the bones of everyone present. Then, in a gesture that defied every assumption about Voidfang behavior, it lowered its massive head in what could only be interpreted as a bow. Admiral Vex, recognizing a diplomatic moment when she saw one, stepped forward and returned the gesture with a formal military salute. What followed was the most unusual diplomatic exchange in human history. Through a combination of Rage's translation, careful gestures, holographic displays, and what appeared to be sophisticated mathematical concepts scratched into the rocky ground, a basic communication began to establish itself. The Voidfang delegation had come in response to Rage's call, a signal that had carried across space in ways human science didn't fully understand, informing them that contact had been successfully made with the humans. But more than that, they had come because Rage had communicated that he had found humans who treated him with what translated roughly as honor, respect, care concepts that were apparently extremely important in Voidfang culture. Over the course of the next 6 hours, a preliminary understanding began to emerge. The Voidfangs were indeed highly intelligent, with a complex society based on concepts of honor, family bonds, and territorial respect. Their aggressive responses to human contact had been defensive reactions to what they perceived as invasion and hostility. The structures in the Northern Valley were revealed to be a kind of monument or historical site, a place where Void Fang ceremonies and gatherings had been held for generations. The regular movements detected by human sensors were pilgrimages, not military exercises. As the day wore on and the communication became more sophisticated, Dr. Phillips raised the question that was on everyone's mind. Why haven't you tried to establish contact with humans before? The response, mediated through rage and a series of complex holographic displays, was both humbling and challenging. The Void Fangs had been aware of human expansion into their territories for decades. They had tried several times to establish peaceful contact, but every attempt had been met with weapons fire and containment efforts. Eventually, they had concluded that humans were a species incapable of recognizing any intelligence that didn't match their own patterns, and had largely withdrawn from areas of human activity. We made the mistake of assuming that first contact protocols would work universally, Admiral Vex admitted. We approached as colonizers, not as neighbors. The largest Void Fang, who had been identified as something roughly equivalent to an ambassador, made a series of sounds that Rage translated into gestures. The meaning was clear. They were willing to try again, but this time the approach would be different. As the formal negotiations concluded, and the Void Fang delegation prepared to return to their ships, the ambassador approached Alara directly. The creature towered over her, its presence both magnificent and intimidating, but its movements were careful and deliberate. It made a single complex sound, then touched one clawed appendage gently to Alara's forehead. Rage immediately moved to her side, making pleased sounds, and from the reactions of the other Void Fangs, it was clear that some significant honor had just been bestowed. What just happened? Admiral Vex asked quietly. Alara looked up at the ambassador, then at Rage, then back at the assembled humans. I think I've just been formally adopted into a Void Fang family structure. The ambassador just acknowledged me as Rage's sister partner. The concepts don't translate exactly, but it's a bond recognized by their entire society. The Void Fang delegation returned to their ships, but not before establishing a preliminary agreement for ongoing contact. A formal embassy would be established on a neutral moon in the system, with both species contributing to its construction and operation. Trade, cultural exchange, and joint scientific endeavors were all discussed as possibilities. But perhaps most importantly, the galaxy's understanding of what it meant to be an intelligent species had been fundamentally challenged and expanded. As the alien ships departed and the humans returned to the station, Alara reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. What had started as a routine xenobiological study had become something much larger. A bridge between species, a challenge to assumptions about intelligence and communication, and a demonstration that sometimes the greatest discoveries came not from maintaining distance and objectivity, but from taking the risk to form genuine connections. Rage remained at the station for several more weeks as his leg completed its healing. And during that time, he became an invaluable aid in developing more sophisticated communication protocols with his species. But eventually the day came when he was ready to return to his own people. On the morning of his departure, Alara stood with him at the edge of the station's main landing platform. The Void Fang delegation had sent a smaller ship to collect him, and she could see familiar figures waiting in the distance. "I'm going to miss you," she said, knowing he couldn't understand all the words, but hoping he understood the sentiment. Rage pressed his forehead against her hand one last time, then made the soft purring sound she had come to associate with contentment and affection. He looked at her for a long moment, those intelligent eyes seeming to memorize her face, then turned and began walking toward the waiting ship. Halfway there, he paused and looked back. Admiral Vex, who had been watching from the station's observation deck, swore later that in that moment, the creature had smiled. 3 months later, Dr. Alara Thorne received official orders from UGF High Command. She was being promoted to head the newly created Interspecies Relations Division with special focus on Voidfang cultural exchange. Her first assignment would be to establish and run the joint embassy that had been promised during those historic negotiations. As her transport approached the embassy station, a remarkable hybrid of human engineering and Voidfang bioarchitecture, Alara could see a familiar figure waiting on the landing platform. Rage had grown even larger in the months since their separation, his armor plates now bearing intricate patterns that marked his new status within Voidfang society. When she emerged from the transport, he bounded toward her with an enthusiasm that would have terrified anyone who didn't know him, settling beside her with the same gentle affection he had shown since that first day in the valley. "Hello again, my friend," she said, running her hand along his armored head, ready to help me build the future. Rage's response was a sound she had never heard before, complex, musical, and unmistakably joyful. Around them, human and Voidfang workers moved in harmony, constructing something unprecedented in galactic history. A space where two vastly different forms of intelligence could meet, learn from each other, and perhaps forge a friendship that would endure across the stars. Years later, when historians wrote about the moment that changed the trajectory of human-alien relations, they would point to the careful diplomacy, the scientific breakthroughs, and the political courage that made it all possible. But Alara always remembered it differently. She remembered an injured creature, alone in a valley, the simple act of offering food to the hungry, and the moment when fear gave way to wonder. Sometimes she reflected the most profound discoveries began with the smallest acts of compassion. The galaxy was a vast place, filled with forms of life and intelligence that challenged every assumption and transcended every boundary. And in one small corner of that galaxy, a human scientist and a creature once thought to be nothing more than a mindless predator stood together, looking out at the stars and the infinite possibilities they held. The future was uncertain, as all futures are, but it was also full of hope, built on the foundation of an unlikely friendship that had already changed the galaxy in ways that were only beginning to be understood. And in the end, perhaps that was enough. Perhaps that was everything.